Oh, I'm Stewart Gordon. I'm currently a professor of keyboard studies at the Thornton School of Music of the University of Southern California.
Okay, Dr. Gordon, tell me about growing up. Where were you born, your parents?
Yes, well, I was born in a little town outside of Kansas City called Olathe, Kansas. My maternal grandparents were, he was a country veterinarian in those days, and my mother went to her parents' house to give birth to me. That was August 28th, 1930. I grew up in Kansas for the first few years of my life. My father had been in the First World War, and he had kept his reserve status. He petitioned to go on active duty, and that was granted. So they left, my parents left, and he was stationed at Fort Bliss in Texas. 6 months after they arrived in Texas, Pearl Harbor hit, and so that changed everything. And we were in war, the Second World War then, and he was transferred from various places. We left El Paso, we went to San Jose, California. He went to Jacksonville, Florida, and after that his unit was sent overseas. I had the first 3 years of high school in Olathe, but my last year, that was in 1946, 45, I guess, and that my last year, the war had ended. The VE Day had been in 1944, and my father was a career Army officer, was stationed in Europe, and I was a part of dependent families who went over to Europe in 1945. Germany was pretty bombed out still in that time. Of course, I had studied piano with various teachers as we had moved around the country. Some of them were quite good, as I look back. Some of them were not very good. I had asked for a piano when I was 10 years old. Funny story, I went to a movie which was called The Great Lie, and it had Betty Davis and Mary Astor in it. So they had clips of Mary Astor playing the Tchaikovsky concerto and various things throughout the movie. And I came out of the theater and I said, that's what I want to do. And at that point, my mother said, oh, I had to take piano lessons. This is a phase, you wouldn't like it. But the grandfather, her father, heard it and bought an old upright and moved it into her living room and said, I'll pay for the boy's lessons, let's see what he can do. And that's how it all started. So then as we had various teachers, as we moved around, and then we ended up being some of the first dependent families to go to Germany. And of course the question was, who was the piano teacher going to be? Well, my father had asked, and of course Germans could not travel at that time. They were in the occupied phase. And I said, well, there's a very famous pianist we were in Frankfurt. There's a very famous pianist who lives in Wiesbaden. His name is Walter Gieseking. And of course I had records of Gieseking. I said, oh my God, Gieseking? So arrangements were made for me to audition for Gieseking. Now you have to understand that this was right after the war. Gieseking's house in Wiesbaden had been spared, but there was heat only in one room, and it was a very cold winter in Germany. So my first year of lessons with Gieseking was taken on an upright with Jutta and Freya, his two daughters, and Annie, his wife, and the cat, all sitting in the same room because it was the only warm room in the house. So they sit and read while I took my weekly piano lessons. And then after that, I came back to the United States, and my father was stationed in Washington. The top teacher in the country was a woman by the name of Olga Samarov at that time. And mind you, I had grown up with spotty teachers, and although I had studied with Gieseking for these 18 months or so, he was not really a teacher. He had a phenomenal facility, but he didn't know how to tell anyone else to do it. I mean, he could tell me with the right notes and the right rhythm and play for me, but that was about all he could do. And so I had not had a good technical background at all. I was musical, and apparently Samaroff heard that musicality. We auditioned for her in her apartment, and she asked me to play something, and I played a piece of Debussy, and she said, "Well, I suppose you've been on a ship coming back and you haven't had a chance to practice recently, have you?" I said, "That's right." She said, "Well, I haven't driven much around New York recently, but I think I know how to drive." I thought, oh boy, she's not going to take it. But she did. She was at the Juilliard School and the top teacher there, but she also had befriended the people who ran a very tiny conservatory in a row house in Philadelphia called the Philadelphia Conservatory of Music. And because she wanted to help this family with their business, she traveled one day a week to Philadelphia to teach on the train, to teach there, and she had a class there. So she said, "You can study with me at Philadelphia." Well, I commuted from Washington up to Philadelphia, and I studied with her, and she came down from New York to Philadelphia, and I had lessons with her for 1 year. She passed away 8 months after I studied with her, but she was an enormously organized person, a brilliant person, a very famous person, and she had an enormous impact on me. I was without a teacher for a spell, and then my father got transferred back to Europe. Meanwhile, Gieseking had started a master class in the unlikely city of Saarbrücken. And Gieseking was very honest when my parents contacted them. And he said, "Well, I don't know if Stewart is good enough to be in my master class. But if he's not ready for that yet, then I'll have him go to an assistant." Well, that was my big risk. I chucked everything over, and I went back, and I went to the Gieseking master class, and it was a time of. You talk about being nervous at USC. It was a time of great insecurity for me because I had risked everything. I had put my whole university on hold in order to study with Gieseking. I was always the runt of the litter as far as technique was concerned. When I was with Samaroff, I felt that everyone else could play better than I. Everyone else was more advanced. Everyone else knew more repertoire. And so I started reading books. I read all the technique books that I could get my hands on. I was trying to find my own way technically. And because I had done that, this gave me, when I was with Gieseking, it gave me a perspective on what he was doing. And as far as I was concerned, I went through a period of being terribly insecure about my own ability. But Gieseking invited my parents and me up to the dinner party. We had started in September, and about November we went up to the dinner party, and everything was fine. But Gieseking pulled my mother aside at one point in the dinner party and said, "Your little boy has done just okay." And that was the first indication I had that I was going to be able to stay in the master class. I still was very insecure, but at least I had made it. He was going to keep me in the master class, because they were turning away people right and left by that time. But he was going to keep me in the master class, and so that allowed me to go on in the master class for several more years.
Was it difficult for you to find friends outside of the master class?
Well, in the first year when we were living in Frankfurt, when I would visit before I went back the second time, I was a senior in high school. I graduated from the Dependence High School, and of course all my friends were Americans, and there was no, and I remember most of those, God, Gabriel, I'm 93. Most of those people have passed on now. I mean, I kept in touch. I had I kept in touch with a couple of girls I was dating with a buddy of mine, Richard Thornton. We kept in touch for many, many, many years. They got married, they had families, and that kind of thing. But there was kept in touch, meaning Christmas card exchanges and that kind of thing. Then that stopped. That stopped when I was about to be drafted, and because we had the draft in those days, and the Korean War was going on at that time, and there was a naval program called the Holloway Act. It was an NROTC program for officers. And my father said, I know how much you want to stay in the Giza King class and pursue your career, but see, my father had been a doughboy in the First World War. He said, if you get drafted into the infantry, your hands will be ruined. So I tried out for the NROTC program, and I had a good academic record with all of those academic courses, and interviewed for that. And so I went to the University of Kansas as a junior. The Navy program would not allow me to take music as a major, so I took speech instead. They would allow that. And I graduated, and I petitioned the Navy, and because I had got the undergraduate degree, and the NROTC program was a 4-year program, I could take my master's also. They let me take music for the master's. Then I served in the Navy. I was a radar expert, so I would guide the planes, and I was able to keep myself in pretty good shape pianistically, because I'd practice aboard ship. They had an old upright there that I would practice on. And I got out of the Navy, and I practiced at home for a while. I didn't have a job. I was a night clerk at a motel for about 8 months before I got a job at Wilmington College. That I would tour and teach, and that's when I started building my career. I was 3 years at Wilmington College, and then I gave a concert at the National Gallery, and that was also very positive. And the man who was head of the music department at the University of Maryland had one of his piano faculty walk in and say, I'm not coming back next year because I'm getting married and I'm moving to California. And so he called up Richard Bales at the gallery because he saw my reviews. He said, is Stewart Gordon still in town? And he said, yeah, he is. His parents live over in Arlington. He's still in town. So he asked me to come out and interview for this job at the university and apply, which I did, and I got the job. And I was there for, oh my gosh, 28 years, something like that. I mean, I stuck with that job. It wasn't much of a music department. It wasn't much of a music department. And so I helped Homer Oleg build that department, putting together a good piano faculty over the years. And eventually I became head of the department after Homer Oleg retired. And I decided that what I needed to do was to start a summer piano program there, a summer piano festival. And the state of Maryland would never fund such a thing, but there was a wing that was funded called the Adult Education Department, and they would experiment with something like that. So I contacted the Adult Education Department, told them what I wanted to do, and they said, all right, we'll give you a budget for the first year, and the dean of the summer school was for it. We'll give you a budget, and if you don't make your budget, then you're going to be responsible for the deficit. I said, okay, let's do it. But we made the budget. As a matter of fact, we went a little over the budget. And what I did was I thought, well, there are all these festivals, but what I'm going to do is to have a festival with master classes and concerts, but a competition at the same time. So we can have all this going on in 1 week. And I'll never forget one critic I think in the Washington Post, when they heard about this, said, another festival and competition at the University of Maryland. Who needs it? But it was a success. And I was able to get famous artists, George Boulez, Alicia De La Rocha, Rudolph Verkushny. In the first year of the competition, there were only about about 15 competitors because it wasn't very well known. But a lot of the kids from Juilliard came down and competed because we had a nice cash prize and that kind of thing. And fortunately, the winner of that competition that year was a young pianist by the name of Emanuel Ax. And so, you know, as Emanuel Ax's career blossomed, the competition blossomed. But it was after I left, you know, I eventually got a vinyl recording contract and made some LPs in those days. Recorded all the Rachmaninoff preludes. I think I was the first person to do all of the Rachmaninoff preludes in one double LP back to back. When I was at the Eastman School, they had a strong keyboard literature program, and there was a very gentle, sweet man who taught the keyboard literature courses. His name was Vern Thompson. And I understood through the grapevine that Dr. Thompson had lost his wife very recently, and he'd moved close to the school, so he didn't have to travel. And he was kind of a lonely man. So when I'd finish in the practice room there, I'd see a light on in Dr. Thompson's office. So oftentimes I'd knock on the door and say, "Hi, Dr. Thompson." He turns out, "Well, I'm doing research on my keyboard literature book. I'm doing research." I said, "Oh, what are you researching now?" "Well, I got some newspaper clippings about Beethoven that so we'd visit." Well, I came back to Maryland, and I heard that Dr. Thompson had passed away. Shortly after, I got contacted by Dr. Thompson's estate saying, "Dr. Thompson has willed to you all of his notes for his keyboard literature book." Because he said, he commented that of all the students, you showed more interest and you might be able to finish it. So what happened was that about 12 boxes of newspaper clippings arrived, and the keyboard literature book wasn't much more than just all of these newspaper clippings and organizations, but he hadn't really started a keyboard literature book at that particular time. But I said, "Well, okay, Dr. Thompson, I guess I owe it to you." So the book is dedicated to him. So I have a keyboard literature book, which it was published in 1996 after I'd come to the University of Southern California. And it's become, he says modestly, at least one of the two most used keyboard literature books across the country.
Were you surprised when you got all that
Oh,
stuff?
I had no idea. I had no idea at all.
On a very different note, you played Debussy when you auditioned for Olga. Do you remember the piece that you played?
Reflet dans l'eau.
From Image.
Uh-huh.
Do you still play it ever?
Well, Gabriel, I don't play anymore. I mean, I sit at that Steinway every day. I make my sit at the Steinway every day for 45, 50 minutes until my shoulder arthritis and my hand arthritis get to the point where I can't take it any longer. And when the pain gets to a certain level, my ears don't turn off. It's a very strange phenomenon because I can play a chord and I'll say, "Is that right?" "Yes, it is right." You know, that kind of thing. And then because my shoulders are very arthritic, every time my hands, I used to do tenths easily. Now I can just barely do an octave, you know, because they have shrunk. And so I always thought that when I retired, I'd be able to learn all the piano pieces that I had never had time to learn before. But I make myself practice that. But that's why I have all of this, because about a year ago I decided I'd become a techie, and you know it's been a very slow, difficult learning curve. But I'm got to the point where now I'm taking all my tunes from my musicals and I'm orchestrating them now, just for fun. It keeps me in the game. I have to think about laying down tracks. I have to think about rhythm. I have to think about harmony. And now in the last month I've been able to do a fairly satisfactory orchestration of two of my tunes. To what end? I don't know. I mean, I'm certainly not going to, my musicals are way too old-fashioned now. I mean, like I've migrated. My greatest were Stephen Sondheim and Cole Porter and all that kind of thing. I do my own lyrics. That's my era. And of course, that's too old-fashioned now. Nobody wants to listen to that. Well, I was at the University of Maryland for I don't know, what did I say, 18 years, something like that. And then I had a boss who was named Shirley Kenny, and she was one of my favorite people. She was an English major, and she was my boss. She was the provost. I became head of the music department, and she was my provost. And Shirley Kenny and I worked on a lot of projects together. She created, with another good friend, who was a conductor, Paul Traver, she created a Handel Festival at the University of Maryland, which is, I don't know if it's still going on. And she supported my piano festival. And she was very much into the arts. And then suddenly Shirley Kenny was going to move to become president of Queens College in New York. It was a step up for her, but it was a different, she was a Southern lady. They called her the Steel Magnolia. And she spoke with a Texas accent, and she was a wonderful person, one of my closest friends. Just a woman who had it all. And at one point, she said to me, because we'd worked together, so she said, "Stewart, you would never think of leaving the University of Maryland and coming and working for me, would you, at Queens College?" She said, you could be my executive vice president. I thought, well, I've been in Maryland all these years. I've never lived in New York. I had many friends in New York. Why not? And it was a huge shock to everyone, because I had been running the festival, and the festival was taken over by another fine musician, a woman who taught next door to me at Maryland. It was named Nelita True, and her husband was a fine pianist with the name of Fernando Leris, and I attended their wedding. And so Fernando Leris took over the festival and ran it. So they had someone to take it who was very close to the Maryland family. And I just pulled up and went to New York because I wanted the New York experience. Well, it was a different experience, I can tell you. The politics of the New York university system are incredibly complex. So, we, as her executive vice president, I had to help her deal with the budget, and we had to appear before the legislature, and we had to deal with all the politics. There were bosses in Queens that we had to deal with. We had to deal with unions. The unions had an evening program for their members, and they wanted certain things, and I had to do that. And then the provost of Queens College didn't like Shirley too well, and so after a year he became the president of another small college in New York, and so they had to find a provost, and so we had a provost search, and I helped Shirley mount the provost search, and we had interviews all of it, and then the search committee and the faculty came to Shirley and they said, I was acting provost at the time, and they said, we like Stewart a lot better than we liked any of those candidates. Would he be provost? So I said, all right, I'll be provost. So I became provost of Queens College. And, and we had, so I was dealing with all kinds of things at that time. And I'm a good administrator, and I think I'm an honest politician, but I treat people fairly. I'm not an abrasive person. And so I was a popular person there. And then I decided that, I was keeping up my piano practice, but I was missing the academic life of teaching music, and I saw that this position had come up at the University of Southern California. And so I sneaked back into my office and looked at my file. I didn't want my secretaries to know about this. And I Xeroxed all my application and sent it out. And a few days later, one of my secretaries came in and she said, Dr. Gordon, there's someone from University of Southern California by the name of John Perry who wants to talk to you. I said, yeah, I know John, I'll talk to him. And so John, who was a very brusque person, said, Stewart, yeah, we got your stuff. Oh, really? Can you come out and play a recital on Saturday night? Well, fortunately, I had played at the National Gallery about 2 months before. I played a concert there. And so I said, yeah, I'll be there. And so I talked to my secretary. You know, I don't feel too well. Could you cancel all my appointments this afternoon? I think I better go home. So I went home to practice.
Do you remember what you played?
Yeah, I played the Mozart K570, B-flat sonata. I played the Schumann Opus 11, first sonata. And I played the Ravel Miroir.
The whole suite?
Yeah. And so I came out and played the recital, and I didn't tell my boss Shirley Kent I was doing that. I just I just asked for a few days vacation time. And I came out and I played the recital, and I didn't hear anything for a long time. I thought, well, that's over with. And then suddenly Larry Livingston was the dean there, and I got a call from Larry Livingston. And he offered me the job. And I don't know if this is public, but he offered me the job at a little less than half of what I was making as a provost of Queens College.
And you took it?
But I wanted to get back into music. And it was the right move for me. I mean, there was no question about it. I didn't, people were saying, people were off the cuff, cocktail parties say, you should go on for a college president. You're such a successful provost. You should be a college president. But I didn't want to deal with the rest of my life with fundraising and politics and all of that kind of thing. I wanted to go back to teaching music. I wanted to go back to dealing with students. And so, and I remember that, I was, one of the worst moments of my life was when I had to tell Shirley Kenny that I was leaving, because we had worked so much together. But ironically, Shirley Kenny became the president of Stony Brook the next year. So she left Queens College also. Very next year, she became the president of Stony Brook, and she was there until her retirement. When I left Queens College and came to USC, I'd never lived in California before. I'd gone through Los Angeles on the plane once, and so I had a good friend who taught musicology at UCLA, Frank Decode, and he was a good buddy of mine because I knew him from Rochester days. So I just have this, and I think. That's why this. That what is an old man in the 90s doing trying to learn Cubase, for God's sakes? Well, I can't move around anymore. I can't change. I've got to stay here. So I have to do something to keep the juices going. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Yeah. And in those days, I could pack up and move to another place.
So music is now your biggest adventure.
Yeah, well, my music and writing, I don't know. I had a very interesting life, but I'm not people have said, oh, you should do your memoirs. Oh, I don't know. I don't think I want to go down memory lane to that extent. I mean, I have a lot of fine memories, and I have a lot of people at my age have passed on. But I'm, going through all of my memoirs step by step. I don't think I want to do that. But on the other hand, my mother was a writer. She was a fairly well-known poet. She was a poet laureate of the University of Kansas, and she had about 7 books of poetry published, and won all kinds of prizes. And even after they moved to Arizona, she was honored by the state of Arizona as one of the resident poets. And when she was at my stage, she was living in Sun City, Arizona, in a retirement facility. She was getting depressed creatively, and so I talked her into writing, into recording on cassettes her experience as an army wife, particularly after the war in Germany. Now, I have all those tapes out there. That story I may write. I haven't had time to get to them. That story I may write, because that's an interesting historical term, and from an army wife's point of view, of being, my mother was a very sensitive woman, of being torn between what she as an army wife had and what she saw all around her, what people didn't have, were going hungry. And she wrote about this sometimes in her poetry. And I know she sat in her armchair in the last days of her life and did that whole story of her experience. And I think there may be a book in there.
Okay.
So that might be one of my projects that I'm going to do. Well, I came across this story of Libby Holman. She was she was the Barbara Streisand of Broadway in the first part of the century, and because of that new style for Broadway singing, she was an instant sensation. She was very, very famous and ran with a very fast crowd in New York, including Smith Reynolds, who was the heir to the Reynolds tobacco fortune. He was pretty much of a playboy, and he pursued her for many months, and finally she agreed to marry him. But he took her down to the South, and here this heir to the Reynolds fortune came with a Jewish woman and a woman of the theater, and so she was not accepted at all in Southern society. Smith had tried to commit suicide once before. He was very unstable emotionally, and on the night of weekend of July 4th, I can't remember the exact year, he was found shot to death in the bedroom that they shared. There were suspicious circumstances around that, and that one of the suspicions was that Libby was carrying on an affair with Reynolds' male secretary, and that was never proved. And they took her into custody, and then I have the actual document. I have the document because it plays a part in the dramatic show. The document was from the Reynolds family, a senior member of the Reynolds family, and the document was carefully worded and said, "We understand that Mrs. Reynolds is a suspect in the death of her husband, Smith Reynolds. Should the evidence not prove sufficient to prosecute her, the Reynolds family would be very grateful." And so the whole thing was dropped. And part of that reason was also it was found out that she was pregnant in the early stages of pregnancy. So the whole thing was dropped. In my theater piece, it opened with Libby coming back, singing a prologue, "Friends in this Cabaret," then kind of recounting the whole thing in song with dialogue in between. That's it was a show that lasted nonstop for about 50 minutes, and one roaming show. It was a real tour de force because there were all styles of singing in there. I copied some of the period singing with songs and that kind of thing. And we hoped, Kelly, of course, hoped that it would catch on to an extent where we do not be able to do gets back us on off Broadway, but it didn't catch on even after 2 years. And by that time, she was married to a guy who was a stage manager at Madison Square Gardens, Timothy Barseca. And they decided they would leave New York and raise a family. So they went up to upstate New York at that point, and she had a couple of 3 kids because they were getting along in years, and they needed to do that. So that was the story. That was the story of Libby.
Okay, I want to back up a little bit.
Yeah.
So let's go a different direction. This is a fun question. If you weren't a pianist, what would you have wanted to be?
If I wasn't a pianist?
You could pick any profession. What would you have wanted to be? If you could go back and do it all over again.
Musical, outside of music?
Anything.
Well, I think I told you I wanted to be Stephen Sondheim or Andrew Lloyd Webber.
Writing musicals would still be
your dream job. That's my big, when I was involved in writing a musical score, a musical production, the whole world could stop. I was totally oblivious to anything else in the world. And it was a wonderful feeling of quiet ecstasy doing that entire time.
And I asked you a similar question 2 weeks ago, but what is the thing that you are most proud of accomplishing?
Oh. Most proud, that's difficult to answer. When I guess the answer would have to be kind of generally, I'm proud of some of the work I have done. I'm proud of some of the books that I have written. As I do the new edition of the keyboard literature book, I'm really proud of how thorough it was. I mean, it was written in the 1990s, and I haven't looked at it since. But I'm proud of that kind of work. Occasionally, I'll run across someone who has read that book. As a matter of fact, I had a teacher bring some of her kids in here just to play for me just a few weeks ago. And she mentioned it. She said the book was so useful. She said all of my parents and my kids have this book, and it's so useful. So I'm proud of that. The fact that it's helping people. I'm proud of the recording of the Rachmaninoff Preludes that I gave you. Because that was one of the first complete recordings, maybe the first complete recording. And I'm proud of that kind of thing. So you asked me what I'm proud of. Well, I can't choose one of the things because I've gotten deeply involved in everything that I've done, and I've enjoyed everything that I've done.
Follow-up question. You're retiring soon.
Yeah.
What are your plans for retiring when you don't have to teach anymore? You don't have to. Well,
I will miss it. I will miss it. Sometimes I wish I hadn't said that I would retire, gone on the retirement track. I maybe could have gone on, but because I'm still in good health. But I will be 94. And a long time ago, I stopped taking freshmen because of my age. You know, I don't think it's fair for someone to go to a school, as many people would request me, as they would do all the faculty, and request you and be studying with the teacher of your dreams and then find that he's no longer in good health and you have to change teachers just before your senior recital. You understand what I mean? So
Yeah.
I really, and as I said to you before, I'm finishing up all my DMA students so that they didn't have to change teachers if they wanted to stay with me online. And so I've got one student in music teaching and learning who's taking piano as a field, and then I've got 2 DMAs who are finishing up the recitals.
Yeah. I went to your website, which has a bio, and so I have some questions about your bio. How many dogs have you had?
Huh. I think the number of bull terriers I've had is, well, I had a couple of bulldogs. I had bulldogs when I was a kid, and then when I got a dog, I started with bulldogs, and I think I may have mentioned that, you know, I went to a dog show to see the bulldogs, and I was leaving just as the bull terriers were coming into the ring. I said, "What are those dogs?" It was immediately love at first sight. Then I started having bull terriers, and I've had about 13 of them, sometimes 4 at a time when I could take care of them. I'll send you, when I get my computer back, I'll send you, I have a picture of a dog, of me with dogs all around me. I'll send you some of my pictures with me and my dogs.
And who was Christopher Reynolds?
Well, Christopher Reynolds was my partner. Chris and I, he was. You ask about Libby Holman and Smith Reynolds. Well, he was of the Tobacco Reynolds family. Libby Holman was his great aunt, as a matter of fact. And Chris and I were together for about 40 years in a relationship, and we shared a home together. And he was a photographer, and many of the photographs he did a lot of photography for magazines, but his passion was photographing architecture, and but he photographed events in our lives, and they were all stored very methodically in scrapbooks. There were about 390 scrapbooks, the big thick scrapbooks. And one of the projects I've been doing, I've been digitalizing all those scrapbooks. You know, some of them I throw away because some of them, there are people that I don't even know who they are even, but some of them I throw away. But that documents we've had a lot of homes. We had a lot of homes. We had I met him when I was at the University of Maryland. We had a couple of homes there. He was from the Reynolds family, and so he had how can I say, he was a very modest guy and had a wonderful sense of humor. Anyone who knew Chris said he was one of the funniest guys they've ever met. But he also had extravagant tastes. I mean, he not so much in food or excessive that way, but he bought too many clothes. He bought too many. He bought that, for example. He insisted that we buy this at an auction.
What is that?
That's a Rafael.
Wow.
Not the original, of course, but that's the Madonna and Child, famous painting by Rafael, in an elaborate frame. My tastes were never as elaborate as Chris's, but that's all right because I tend to be a kind of simple, modest guy, and we balanced each other very, very well. So this was, and we had he moved to New York with me. We had a house on Long Island there, and then when I finally decided to come to USC, we had several houses. We had the house downtown first of all, and then we moved out to here. We had the house next door to here. I may have mentioned that before. You know, had the house next door, and then Chris's health began to decline, even though he was, 10 years younger than I was. But his health began to decline, and he had to fight a number of things. He had something called CML, chronic myeloid leukemia, and they had a wonder drug called Gleevec, which saved his life, but it also destroyed his kidneys, so he had to go on dialysis. They gave him too much of the drug when it was still experimental, but it saved his life. And so he had to go on dialysis, and then that also destroyed his circulatory system. So gradually, about 7 years ago, he fought it and fought it and fought it, and gradually he began to lose his extremities. You know, and when they had to, they said when the circulation was no longer in his lower legs, and he had to, they said they would have to take off his lower legs. We had consultations with Kaiser, and so he chose to go off of dialysis, which is a way he committed legal suicide rather than to lose his legs, because they said the legs and then the fingers, because the fingers were turning blue and there was nothing they could get the circulation to them. They tried running tubes down veins and things, but they didn't work. And so, and he was in a lot of pain at the end, and it was a tough decision, and it was hard on me because I didn't want to lose him. But as he said to me, he said, "Well, I know I'm sorry to have to leave, but you're not in pain, and I am." So he came home. We were living in Claremont then, and we had to move to the desert because of his arthritis. He had rheumatoid arthritis too. We had that house up the hill, and we had rheumatoid arthritis. I had an adopted sister who passed away, and I had helped her get her. She was a government worker, and I had helped her get her apartment, condominium in D.C. And so we went back and sold the condominium, and with that money, we bought a house in Palm Springs so that Chris could escape the fog that comes in here. And it got so that he really had to live in Palm Springs. He really had to live in Palm Springs. And then when he got so he couldn't, and I used to commute back and forth, because there he could find relief from the arthritis and he could function there. Not easily, but he could function there because of the dry weather. And then when it got so that he had a couple of bad falls, and I said, well, we're going to move halfway in to Claremont. I was doing a little bit of moonlight teaching at Claremont Graduate Center, and at that time I said we'll move to Claremont because it's not as dry, but he could stand that, and that is commutable, so that I can go home every night and take care of him if he needed. And then after he came home, at the end there, he was in, he lived for another 21 days at home, and we were together. I came in and taught. I had someone to come in and sit with him while I would get back, and then on the morning of March 8th, 2016, he was sitting in his big chair, and I said, well, let me go get you some breakfast. And I went into the kitchen, which was right there by the room, and I turned around, he was gone. So that's the story of Christopher Reynolds.
Have you thought about writing about him?
Well, I could write about him. I have mixed. You see, Chris was as I say, he was a very funny person. He was a very social person. I mean, you know, he was a person who could make friends with anybody. He could keep a conversation going with anybody, you know. But at some point, he was a very private person. And when he came home, he made me, this is very unusual, but he made me swear that I would not have any kind of memorial service for him, and I would not do any obituary for him. And he sat in that chair in the last 21 days of his life. He called up everyone, and he said goodbye. He called up all of his friends in the East. He called everyone he knew to tell them goodbye. He said, and that's the way I want them to remember me. You know, and we both have, what's that company called? You know, the cremation company. Oh, heck. Well, I can't remember. We both have contracts to be cremated. And he had wanted that, and we both did that together. So that's our story.
How do you want to be remembered?
Well, I'm pretty much, I'm not as adamant as Chris was about it, but I'm pretty much the same way. I am remembered in my students. You know, I'm very fortunate because students come out and visit me and bring me flowers and a bottle of wine and that kind of thing. And sometimes they bring their students in for me to hear. And I said a student of mine and her husband flew down from Oregon just to see me. And I'm very fortunate in this way because I'm remembered by my students, and I guess that's the answer to your question. I'll be remembered by my students.
Then I have one more question for today.
All right.
When I'm your age,
What?
when I become your age, what is one thing or a few things that you hope I will have learned in that time?
Well, I'm a great believer in the efficacy of life. So, you know, I look back on my life and I say, you know, I'd go on forever if I could, even with all the, you know, if my body held out, I'm enthusiastic about. I'd go on as long as I could, and I think that's what I would wish on you or anyone else, to feel positive about living and about life and about creating. Even though you know it has to come to an end, that is life for everyone, but to have a positive feeling about living your life. And if there is such a thing as reincarnation, to be ready and willing to do it all over again.
Thank you. Okay, that's all we needed.